Welcome again to Coastal Matters. I'm Charlie Walters. This is a monthly presentation co-produced by the Nantucket Coastal Conservancy in conjunction with Nantucket Community Television. My guest today is Crocker Snow Jr., who is one of only two parties, the other party being the town of Nantucket, who owns land on Muskeget Island. He's also the author of a book called Muskeget, Raw, Restless, Relentless Island. Thanks for coming on the show, Crocker.
Good to be here.
I think Muskeget is someplace that, I think of it as a place that is so close to Nantucket, and yet very few people know anything about it other than spotting it on the map. So give us a quick primer on what Muskeget is, how big it is, and
Sure.
so on.
Well, number one, you're right. It's about 10 miles, 12 miles from where we're sitting right now, and yet this is center of action and civilization, and that is exactly the opposite. Nobody lives there. There's no electricity, no running water, and it is very raw in that sense. The island itself is about 250 acres now. There's not a tree on it, which suggests to you that it's very low. The highest point on the island is about 15 feet above sea level. And that's it in one sense. In another sense, with all the species that inhabit the island and come and go, it's very full of life.
Are there ponds on Muskeget?
There used to be, I've been going there for 65 years, since I was 9 years old, and there used to be 3 inland freshwater, basically freshwater ponds. Today there's 1, partly because of erosion and partly other things. So there's really only 1 freshwater pond left, and obviously ducks and geese and seagulls and others require that periodically, so that's one of many things that is a changing element of the island.
So it is potable water.
Yeah, we bring our own, but it's barely. I'd say it's brackish. I wouldn't like to drink a lot of it.
Now, of those 250 acres, and that makes it something less than a square mile, I guess, if I remember my measurements, how much do you own and how much does the town own?
When this all started back in 1949, my father was the one who got involved, and my family, my father, myself, owned roughly a half of the island. And the island is moving fairly dramatic, well, dramatic may be too much, but it is moving towards the east. In other words, it's moving your way. And Nantucket is losing land constantly. So now I think of it as 2/3 ours and 1/3 Nantucket.
So at some point, you may find yourself owning the entire island.
It could be, or maybe we're going to own some real estate on Nantucket. You better get your your bid in.
But this is non-developable for a lot of reasons.
Correct.
If you could talk about some of those reasons.
Well, number one, it doesn't make a lot of sense to develop it in any way because there's no, as I've already said, there's no fresh water, there's no electricity, there's nothing there. And it's pretty rough, particularly in the winter. But because it's a national natural landmark and because we have a conservation restriction with the Nantucket Land Bank, you cannot build on it anyway. That's part of the deal. And I was very aggressive in a way to make that happen about 9 or 10 years ago because the island, our part of the island is owned by myself, my nephew, and my 5 sons. And we all felt exactly the same, that we want the island to stay forever wild for what it is. It really is wild. And to assure that, I really pushed hard to get a conservation restriction on the entire island with the town of Nantucket. Oddly enough, the town of Nantucket was a little bit reluctant in the beginning. And over time, after several select meetings and so forth, they went along and the governor had to sign it, et cetera, but it's a conservation restriction for the entire island.
And just to be clear, this Muskeget is part of the town and county of Nantucket.
That's correct, yep. It's just the other side of Tuckernuck. A lot of people know about Tuckernuck.
I guess you can't see it from Mattocket, but if you look hard, if you're on the ferry,
You're right.
you can
I
probably
actually
barely
came
make it out.
Yeah, I came by the ferry today, and it was a beautiful day. And if you know where Tuckernuck is and you see the western bluff, then you look sort of a few degrees to the right, and you can see a tiny little rectangle, which is our camp.
And that's the only building.
It's the
On
only,
the
there's
island.
1.5 left.
What's the half?
Well, the half is the land, the long-known Nantucket family, the Holgates, had a camp on the western side, i.e. on Nantucket land, and they had to move it because of erosion on the west, and they really didn't have any technical, legal right to move it, and there's been kind of a stink about it with the town ever since, and then lightning hit the camp, and it's pretty much a shell now. They don't use it any longer.
Obviously, you need a boat to get there, but it's not as simple as that sounds.
It isn't. We used to fly in much more. My father was a very well-known pilot and a bush pilot and other things, and there was a seaplane fellow in New Bedford, Norman Gingras, that a lot of old-timers would remember, and we could get in that way. Now it's really tough. You really got to know what you're doing with a plane to get in there.
You can't land on the island.
Well, we could. No, Dad
Really?
could in the
Really?
middle of the island because he was an old bush pilot, and we cleaned up a kind of a runway. I wouldn't really call it a runway. 3 people have tried to get in since then, and 2 of them haven't made it very well, to be honest. Now, getting there by boat is more and more difficult than it used to be because the whole sort of southern shore of the island was protected by a big shoal and a big point on the southwest, south side. That broke off. Then it got smaller and smaller in the hurricanes and everything else. It virtually disappeared. So the whole southern shore of the island, there's a lot of current and tide that come from the west along that, therefore much more erosion. And from the hurricanes and so forth, the island is hit pretty hard.
How long has it been an island?
I don't know. I can fake it. I can fake a lot of things. But there is records of the island about 350, 400 years ago. Mm-hmm. At one point, it was connected with Tuckernuck for a brief, maybe it looks like about 30 years. And sometimes, even as recently as 1940, on a very, very low tide, you could walk from Tuckernuck around to the big point and then around
Really?
and that's not been done for the last 60-some years, so far as I know.
In your book, Muskegon, you write about the 1938 hurricane and a gentleman named Marcus Dunham.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that story?
Well, everybody in Nantucket knows about the Dunham family probably, and Marcus himself, he was very close with the Coffin family, and he was the caretaker for a bunch of people that were either clamming or scalloping there, but then there was a branch shooting club. The eastern side of the island, which we eventually purchased, was owned by a brant shooting club, most of them from Philadelphia. Dunham was there as a caretaker, got hooked there hung up there when the 38 hurricane came in, and his record of that in the local paper that he only gave to them 3 or 4 months later tells a very sort of cold-blooded story about how he survived. All of the shacks got knocked down. He rolled with one in the water, got up on, and then eventually got through the water against 90, 100-mile-an-hour winds to the one dune that was still above water, and just hunkered down there through the worst of it. And he was a really tough individual, and he said it was by far the most frightening thing he'd ever done. But that's simple. That's the story simply. And there's a lot of stories connected with the island, and most of them are true.
So I guess at no time was the island completely underwater, but it came awfully close
Yes.
during that storm.
Yes, and I have been there in a relatively much smaller hurricane. I think it was 53 or 54. My father was there, and he came in with his plane. I was with him, obviously. It was a Navion, and we kind of got hooked. The weather was not really predicted, and the water came up and up and up. We ended up going out to the middle of the island to hold down the wings of the plane. The water was up over the cowling of everything of the plane. We didn't know how far it was going to keep coming. And then it sort of stopped and started very slowly. But that's in the center of the island, and it was pretty hairy at the time. I mean, I was a much younger man, and I wasn't prepared for the howling winds and the. I mean, you feel very small out there in a big storm. You can't see any land around you, obviously, and all you can see is spew and water and white cats.
Has there been a time that we know of when anyone lived out there year-round?
No. There was a Coast Guard boathouse there, started in 1910. That is the one surviving structure, and we call it our camp. And that was occupied from 1910 to 1930 during all the shipwrecks around Nantucket, Tuckernuck, Muskeget. And they had amazing stories about what those fellows did, including in the Shipwreck Museum here. Now, it turns out that those fellows were only out there about 8, 9, 10 months a year. They weren't there year-round. They weren't there in the head of winter. It's just too tough, simply stated.
When it was connected to Tuckernuck, and before that strip of sand was submerged, was it easier to get there in those days by boat? Were the currents
Well,
different?
certainly, yes, because you could get inside there. When I was a youngster, and for up until about 30 years ago, 25 years ago, there was that big hook on the south side. So once you got inside that, you were in much better situation. Now it's not there. So you anchor out with 2 anchors, or if you have a very small boat, you go out on the beach. But the current, it's more the current than the tide that's troublesome. And yes, it was much easier to get there. We actually had a pier there at one point to tie up to. But once that went away, the southern part of the island is just very exposed. The northern part you can go on to in certain weather, but you can't keep a boat there at all.
Well, in your experiences there over the years, how often do you look up and see somebody else on the island with you?
You mean unexpectedly?
Unexpectedly.
Oh, it happens. We used to go out there, and we still do like to go out there duck hunting at Thanksgiving whenever we can. And there's a couple of fellows from Nantucket that every year on Thanksgiving, weather permitting, they kayak out there, go get in the island, and then kayak back. I've had a couple of hairy situations out there when people came. They did not know I was there. I didn't know they were there, and they weren't up to good. One particular situation, but not as a general thing. People certainly land on the island because they're shipwrecked or other things, and many, many times we find people leaving notes at our camp saying, we use some of your water, we use that, thank you so much, and blah, blah, blah. So I would say 90% of the time, everybody is in very good intentions. I am concerned as sort of a steward. You describe me as the owner, and I don't think of myself that way at all. I really think that the island is owned by nature. It's owned by the species that live there, and I'm there to observe it and facilitate it in a way. I don't want to sound too romantic, but that's the way I feel about it. And I guess I'm more sensitive about how the species are coming and going, and these sort of rows of different species that dominate the island, and then another one does. And I'm fascinated by the question: is it I mean, you can see climate change out there in a bottle. That's point one. but I'm fascinated by, I'm not a scientist, I'm a journalist, and I'm reasonably observant, I guess. And is it the climate change that's affecting the species? Which is the cause and which is the effect? Is it the species causing the change of the island, or is it the other way around? And that's a pretty basic, fundamental question. I don't have the answer to it, but I can see the changes all the time.
Let's talk about the flora and fauna. You said there are no trees.
Right.
What vegetation do you see out there?
Well, beach plum and stuff like that, but mostly poison ivy is what keeps the island together. It's really poison ivy. Valhalla in the summer, that's for sure. And there's a lot of little scrub bushes that are coming up now. There's always been some. There's a lot more lately.
You mean scrub oak, that sort of
Yeah,
thing?
not really scrub oak. No, they're all evergreen. They're sort of scrub. They're like cedars, but they don't go up. They go out. And I should know, but I don't know. But a lot of beach plum, for sure. And that's about it. There's not a lot of variety of there certainly is of the animal life, but not so much in the. Now, I'm not a horticulturist at all, so I can't tell you some of the things. And there was a very good book written about it by a scientist about 50 years ago now called Time-Lapse Ecology, and he really had a CAT scan of the island of all the different types of vegetation that he found in small amounts here and there. And clearly there is a lot more variety than I'm telling you, because there wouldn't be so many different species that come and go unless there was.
Now, you mentioned geese and ducks, but there's also a vole.
Yes.
Tell us about that vole.
Well, technically it's called a Microtus breweri. How's that for a name? And simple way to think about it is the beach vole. I am told, and I think it's true, that it's the only place in the world, in the universe, that this particular vole can be found, i.e. it's unique, not just technically, it truly is unique to the island. And what's notable about this particular beach vole is that it doesn't tunnel. It goes on the surface. It goes through tunnels. Doesn't tunnel down in the winter. It goes through the, by then, dead poison ivy. And you can see all their tracks, not all over the place. They go in trails all over the place. A lot of people used to go out to study them, would track them, and now it's interesting that in the last 20 years, there's almost no scientists that have, the people that were the experts on this, one of the two has passed away, and there hasn't been a real study of the population of them in the last 8 or 10 years. My observation is they're in trouble, because I don't see nearly as many around right now. I think I know the why, but I'm not at all sure. It's a hypothesis. One fellow from who's well known around here, his name is Rob Stevenson. He's from UMass. He knew enough about them to go out there at my behalf about a year ago, just for the day, not a serious study of where how they're doing. And he came back and said superficially he found a lot less than used to be, and they're only in the northwestern corner of the island with any numbers. Whether that's fully accurate, I can't tell you right now.
Well, I guess another point, I'm not sure how long ago it was, but they actually did disappear from the island,
Yeah.
and they were only on a sandbar off the island.
That's absolutely right. Absolutely right. It's in my book. And no, what happened is while the Coast Guard guys were there, one guy brought a cat to the island. I don't know, I'm making it up, 1909 or something. And then the scientists came the next year, couldn't find a beach vole. The cat had cleaned them all out. He found a few of them in a little small shoal just off the island that had some grass, was smart enough to go out there and found a few. obviously got rid of the cat and got those back, and then they started, like rabbits again, they started coming back. And I think I'm accurate in telling you that the last time there was a real serious scientific study of this, and I told you it was 16, 17 years ago, I think. The population then, they sort of thought was probably, it wasn't guesstimate, but they thought there was probably 2,500. Now,
And that's in less than a square mile, so that's...
yeah, you'd see them around. We'd see them in our
that's a fair
camp.
amount.
Yeah, and they were pretty tame. When you found one, you could pick it up, and I didn't play with it particularly, but it wasn't scared. Now I really have to look to find them. Right now, in the last 2 years I've been there, I know they're still there, but not in the same abundance that they were.
Do you get rabbit out there?
No.
Or
No
about
rabbits.
deer? Do deer ever show up?
The answer is no, and it's curious why, because Tuckernuck's close enough and deer swim. It is really curious. One of my father's pals who used to live in the vineyard, he was he totally suckered my father once, because my father would come in with his plane, and he had planted some deer antlers near the plane, so Dad would find it, and Dad got all excited that a deer had come over from Tuckernuck, and then, 6 months later he said, I just put them there. No, that is very curious, honestly.
And then there were seals.
There are plenty of seals. Plenty of seals. I think most of your viewers may very well know that Muskegon has become the epicenter of the gray seal breeding and birthing. And the gray seal population that is growing so rapidly in the Cape and Islands, as I said, the engine for that is Muskegon, for the birthing and the breeding. To be more specific about it, as recently as 1964, gray seals were thought to be extinct anywhere in the North Atlantic. And then they found one actually on Muskegon, sent it right away to the Harvard Zoological place, and they said right away, yes, this is a gray seal. The fishermen knew that there were few around, very few. Anyway, for going there all the time, there used to be a few there after this. And then the 1972 Marine Mammal Protection Act started and protected the gray seals. There used to be 20, 25 off on the shoals. And the scientists would come from Woods Hole or MIT or Mystic, and I'd go around with them sometime. And there's Harold, and there's Ellen, and there's, each one had a name. Is that one going to migrate to Sable Island or not? And then it started going up and up, just visibly. And by the time it was about, so I've looked back, when there were only 20 there, that was 1995. So that's roughly 20 years ago. Then they started going up to 100, 200, and I started asking these scientists, what's going on here? And specifically, the seal scientists at the time said, don't worry about it. They're never going to get past 1,000. There's not enough for them to eat, or there's going to be disease, one or the other. Well, now there's more than 10,000.
10,000? Less
During
than a
this,
square mile.
Yes, during this period of from mid-December through early days of March. The basic process, or whatever, the reproductive process of a gray seal is that the pregnated cows, typically in the coldest time of the year, try to get in a very remote area, swim to that, go onto the beach, give up their pup, stay with the pup for typically 3 weeks while the pup is weaning. And then about 3 weeks later, the big bulls hit the beach and they want to reproduce. And typically what happens is the cows leave their pup after about 3 weeks and spend several weeks on the island, and so the pups are on their own typically for 3 weeks before they're strong enough to get back to the water and go off on their own. And I have been in the middle of what I'm describing, and it's hard to describe. The smell, the noise, the fights constantly, and it feels like I sort of now call it the seal riot, because 10,000 seals, and I think your viewers know that the gray seals are big seals. They're nothing like harbor seals. They're called horseheads because their profile is like a horse. And the big one, the big bulls get up to 800 pounds. That's what people are amazed to hear that, but they're as big as a grizzly bear. So they're big animals, and they are there to breed, and the cows very often don't want to breed, and there's a lot of stuff going on if they want to breed and the cow doesn't want to give up its pup. I have certainly seen them just grab the pup and kill it and throw it in the air like a little piece of meat. It's sort of like the Serengeti with the lions. And it's quite a scene. And then, amazingly, as soon as the pups are ready to hit the water and the new year of breeding has happened, then they start leaving the island very quickly. And if you went there in early April, mid-April, you wouldn't see a seal on the island.
None at all.
They're all gone. They're in the shoals right near there, and you'll see it. Those are black with them. And then they start heading over towards Monomoy. And now
Monomoy Island on the Cape.
Yes. And
Not
now,
Monomoy, Nantucket.
No, Monomoy in the island, in the Cape, the elbow of the Cape. And now out to Wellfleet, Truro, because they're definitely moving more and more on the outer Cape. And the scientists are now finding more breeding of them on Monomoy. They don't know yet whether any of this big group here on Great Point is just hauling out here, or there's no, I shouldn't say this, I don't know. I'm unaware of any knowledge that they're breeding here.
Breeding on
Great Point.
On Great Point.
I mean, you've got a big colony there now.
Yeah.
And fishermen can't go there because they're supposed to be, the signs say they shouldn't go within 50 yards of these, and actually that I could tell you more about that, because that's not actually, that's a guideline. It's not it's not a law at all. But it's a very, yes, Muskeget is the center of this, and the issue of the growth of the gray seals in the Cape and the islands and the effect they're having on human interactions is whether you want to call it a problem, I don't know, but it's certainly a bigger issue than it has been.
And just to be clear, a gray seal is something of a misnomer, because they don't have to be gray.
No, they're every type of color.
They can be jet black, they can be close to white.
Exactly. They look like, like horses. I'm a horse person, and they're all different colors.
Well, they have very thick necks, and if one is far enough out of the water at the right angle, it looks like a gorilla swimming in the water.
Yeah.
It has that same kind of a silhouette.
Well, you first see them in the water, and they're very curious. They come up, they have these big eyes, and I wouldn't say they're cute, but they're not ugly in the water. When you see them all on the beach the way I have, and they don't when they come out to breed, they spread way out. They want some privacy. So they're getting more and more all over the island, not near the water. And they've gotten into the freshwater ponds and other things that I could tell you about that. They've certainly gotten on our camp. They've gotten on the porch. They've gotten under the camp and so forth. What I can say from my observation in Muskeget, whether it's true in other places, I couldn't say. But they are getting more and more aggressive towards people on Muskeget. They used to be very shy if there were 200 or 300 or 400 there, and you'd go near the beach and land with a boat, and they just head for the water because they were close to the water. Now they're more and more inland because they need more space. They've pushed, go west, young man, sort of thing. And I have absolutely found them to be standing their ground, and they can move very fast. It's surprising, but if they want to move humping along, they can go very fast. And
you don't want to hang around.
well, you don't. I mean, I would never think of that 10 or 12 years ago, but at least in Muskeget, I do. I'm careful about it. And one specific thing happened, and this was now 2 or 3 years ago. I happened to go over the island in a low-flying plane, about to join some scientists from NOAA scientists and MIT to go out to the island, and I was going out with them in January. And as we went over the island, it was clear, and we've got a picture of it, in fact, it's in the book, I think, that there were 4 or 5 seals on the porch of our camp. And that was new to me. The next day we arrived by boat. They were still there. The scientists were very reluctant to do something about it, and I wasn't. It's a private land, and they wanted to get into the camp, and I wanted to get into the camp. So I got into the camp without going by the porch, and then thought that as soon as I got near there, they'd clear out. Well, they didn't at all. And 1 was a bull, and 3 were, whether they were pregnant, I couldn't know. But I, without being melodramatic, I got an old harpoon that we have in the camp, an old whaler type harpoon, and started, to protect myself and to try to get them off. And the scientists said, even though technically I wasn't supposed to do that, it is private land. They wanted to get into the camp, the scientists did, and so they weren't stopping me from doing it. And I basically had to probe them off the thing, and that's something certainly new from my experience. The other thing, I don't know if you want me to mention it, but the other thing that is notable about the gray seals in Muskeget is that for the last 4 years, a group from MIT who are experts on influenza have been doing testing of the pups at Muskeget. And for 4 years in a row now, enough that they can say it's not aberrational, they've found avian flu in 20% of, avian flu traces in 20% of the Muskeget pups. That is the first time they've ever found avian flu in a gray seal. Now, they're passive carriers. I could tell you much more about it. I think I know why, and they think that I'm correct. But they're still studying it a lot to what is the implications of this. But now they've found it for 4 years in a row, and it could be, over time, a very difficult situation.
Before we go, I'd like you to tell us about the film. There's a short film that was made recently about Muskeget.
It's called Unintended Consequences, and a very good photographer here in Nantucket that almost all of your viewers know or know about, Kit Noble, did it with me last year. I think we were out there on January 15th at the height of this, and we've done a 11-minute film that sort of highlights the unintended consequences of this rapid growth of gray seals on Muskeget and the influence or the implications of that in Great Point and Monomoy and elsewhere.
And how can one see this?
You can go, we do not have it on YouTube yet, but you can go on a Vimeo and get it that way. If you want me to look in my wallet, I can even tell you how to get it, the actual Vimeo number that you can pull it up.
Okay.
We've done 3 or 4 presentations of it, all kinds of questions, particularly in the Outer Cape. I could go out there every week presenting it because it's had some influence on people.
Is it on Facebook? Can you access it
No,
that way?
not yet. It's going to be pretty quickly, but people here may know the Seal Abatement Coalition, which started a lot of the efforts to try to get a proper population number of how many gray seals there are and so forth. They actually paid for that, and they're deciding exactly how they want to make it available. The simple answer is it's in process right now.
Crocker Snow Jr., thank you for joining me. This has been fascinating.
Good.
I hope you'll come back sometime.
It'd be good to do so.
For Coastal Matters, I'm Charlie Walters. Thanks for tuning in. Please join us next time.